todos, sean bienvenidos y bienvenidas a este webinar.
Good morning,
Buenos
everybody,
días,
and
buenas
welcome to this
tardes,
webinar.
buenas noches, desde donde se estén
Good morning, good
conectando.
afternoon, wherever you may connect. And I'm Patricia
Mi nombre es
Miranda. I'm a
Patricia
director
Miranda, soy la
for
directora
the
de Incidencia Global
Latindadd,
de
and I'm
Latindadd,
pleased to moderate this
y hoy
webinar
tengo
on
el
the
gusto de moderar
evolution
este
and
webinar
priorities of
sobre la
G20 and
evolución y
G7
prioridades
in
del
the
G20 y
present
G7
economic
en el
scenario.
escenario
This webinar
económico
is organized
actual.
by Latindadd,
Este
Justice
webinar es
Brazil,
coorganizado por
that
Latindadd,
that
por
are
Gestos Brasil,
G
que es parte del
Capitale,
G20,
Italy, and by
por GCAP
APNDD, that's
Italia
our
y por
partner
APMDD,
organization
que
in
es
Asia,
nuestra
and Asia,
organización aliada en
it's the
Asia,
Asian
Asian
People's
Pacific
Movement.
Movement, Asian People's
In
Movement
the
on
first
Debt
place, I
and
want to
Development. En
say
primer
that
lugar,
we have
quisiera
a
mencionar que
available
tenemos
simultaneous
traducción.
interpreter. You can
Pueden
choose the
elegir
language of
el
your
idioma de su
preference by
preferencia
clicking at the
en
bottom
la
of your
parte
screen.
inferior
And
de
for
sus
those of you
pantallas.
who are
Por otro lado, a
connecting
quienes se están conectando a
in the
través
live
de
broadcast and
la transmisión
other
en vivo y
apps that
otras
are also
aplicaciones que
available
también
and
tenemos
require
disponibles y
interpreting, we
requieren
suggest that you
traducción, les
connect through
sugerimos
the
que
Zoom
se conecten por
app,
Zoom,
because
ya
this
que
is
es la
the
traducción
official
oficial que
webinar
tiene este webinar.
translation app. I'm
Bueno,
now going
voy
to
a
also mention that
también me
Latindadd is
gustaría
organizing a
comentar
number of
que
webinars
Latindadd está organizando una
about
serie de webinars
G20. This is a
alrededor
very
del
important
G20 en
topic
torno
throughout the
a esta
region
temática
and
tan importante
worldwide.
en la
And
región y
we
el
have
mundo.
already organized
Tenemos
a webinar about a
organizamos
month
previamente
ago.
ya
This
un
is our
webinar
second
hace
session
aproximadamente un mes y
when
esta es
we want
esta es la
to
segunda sesión en la que queremos conversar con mayor
dive deep
profundidad
into
sobre el
G20
G7
and
y el
G7
G20.
because these
Y es que
groups have
ambos
been
grupos se han
organized
conformado
to address
para
the
abordar momentos
periods
de
of
crisis
financial
económica
crisis as well as
y
geopolitical
también desafíos
challenges.
geopolíticos.
However, over time,
Sin
we
embargo, en el
have
transcurso del tiempo,
assessed
podemos
role
evaluar
and
cuál ha
impacts
sido
of
el
the
rol y cuáles
policies
son
that
los
have in the past
impactos
in the
de las
framework of a
políticas que se
G20
han
and
tomado
G7,
en el marco del
which
G20 y
are
del G7, que
which
son
are groups
grupos
that have
que
been
también han tenido una serie de
criticized about
críticas
their
respecto a
capacity and
su
representation
capacidad de
worldwide and their
representatividad a nivel
legitimacy.
global y
A
también por
number
la
of
legitimidad.
policies that have been
Una serie de
adopted
políticas
over
que se han
time
ido
in the
tomando
recent
en estos
decades by
años, en
these
estas
groups of
décadas, a
countries, in
partir de
particular
estos grupos de países,
political and
sobre todo
financial
políticas
architecture
económicas,
policies have a
arquitectura
global
financiera,
impact.
tienen un impacto a
In
nivel
this
global porque se implementan a nivel
context
global.
of multiple
En este
crises that we are
contexto de
living
crisis múltiple en el que
through
estamos
now,
viviendo ahora,
multilateralism is
el
also
multilateralismo también
undergoing
está
difficult
atravesando
times as
por
well.
un momento
This
también
year,
difícil.
the G7 is
Este año el
led by
G7
Italy
está
and G20 by
liderado
Brazil.
por Italia y el
The
G20 por
eyes
Brasil.
of the world
Los
are on
ojos
Brazil.
del
Italy
mundo
will
están en
have a
Brasil. Italia
G7
tiene su
summit in
cumbre, el G7 Italia tiene una cumbre
July,
en junio,
not
no falta mucho
very
para
far
esto,
away,
y
and
Brasil
Brazil has
tiene la
planned its
cumbre
summit
planificada
for
para noviembre de este año.
November. In
En
prior
los años
years,
anteriores,
Italy, Indonesia, and
tanto
India
Italia como Indonesia e
chaired
India
the G20
tuvieron
group.
la
One of
presidencia
our
del G20.
concerns and
Hay una serie
demands
de
from the side
preocupaciones
of
en el
civil
ámbito de sociedad
society
civil en
on
torno a
economic and financial
temas
issues
económicos que son
are
similares,
similar and
tienen demandas
for both
y
G20
mensajes
and
similares,
G7.
tanto
That's
para el
why we
G7 como
thought
para el
that it'd be
G20.
important to
Por este
organize this
motivo nos ha
webinar so
parecido
that we can
importante
organize,
organizar este webinar
share
para
the
reunir
experiences of civil
experiencias
society
de organizaciones
organizations
de
that
sociedad civil que participan,
participate
de
in
ambos
both
grupos que
groups, in both
participan de ambos
spaces,
espacios,
so that we
y que
can
finalmente
speak with
podemos también
one
unir
voice
voces
to
hacia una
advocate our
incidencia
issues
en
in
el
both the
G7 y
G20
en
and
el
G7.
G20.
Brazil is
Brasil
chairing
tiene la presidencia del G20 este año,
G20 this
está en
year,
nuestra
and
región
we
y desde
feel that
Latindadd nos parece muy
it's
importante
important that we create
generar
this
este espacio
forum
de
for
intercambios y de
sharing
diálogos
experiences and
en
for
torno a lo que pueden ser
conversation
las
in
prioridades
regards of
del
G7.
G20. Sin más preámbulo, voy a presentar a nuestros
Ahora voy a
panelistas.
cambiar.
And I'm going to switch to English now. We have an amazing and brilliant panel today. I would like to introduce to Mónica Di Sisto. She is from Fairwatch. and GCAP Italy, but at the same time, this year, she is the coordinator of the Economic Justice and Transformative Working Group of the Civil 20. At that end, I have the pleasure to work with her in the coordination of this group. I would also like to introduce May Buenaventura. She is the Senior Program Manager for Debt and Green Economic Building of the Asian Pacific Movement on Debt and Development. We have also the pleasure to have with us Claudio Fernandez. He is from Gestos, Brazil, and he is currently coordinating the just, inclusive, and anti-racist economies of the C20 Brazil, that I also have the pleasure to work with him and coordinate this group. And finally, we have the pleasure to have here in this panel to Tatiana Beringer. She is the G20 responsible for the finance track link with the civil society. Thanks, Tatiana, for being with us here. And I also want to highlight the importance of, from the G20 to assign one specific person to have this liaison with civil society organizations. So I would like to start by inviting and giving the floor to Claudio Fernandez. Claudio, what are the challenges and opportunities for civil society organizations in these spaces, in these spaces like the C20 or the C7? You have been part of them for many years now. So, and now you are currently are part of the leaders of the Civil 20. Claudia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I hope you hear me well. Yes. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, my colleagues, part of this webinar. Thank you for the audience. It's very exciting and at the same time, very timely to have this webinar because we are on our way to build our recommendations to the G20 as part of the civil society group of 20. Confirm my speaking language. Just a second. So it determines my language. Yes, and so the C20, the civil society official engagement group with the G20 has started working and building on legacy, on the legacy of the other C20s, as Patricia explained, was presided by India and then Indonesia and Italy before that, Saudi Arabia before that. So those were the last 4 G20 presidencies. And there is quite a bit of work that has already been done, both in analysis of the situation, including the pandemic, including the new multilateral arrangements and the new initiatives that are coming out of the UN, for instance, or from the international financial institutions such as the World Bank or the IMF. And several recommendations have already been built throughout the years. And to reply to the first question that Patricia asked me, the opportunity and the challenge that the civil society organizations have during the C20 and the C7 moments is to try and influence the decisions of the G7 and the G20, meaning influence the decisions of the governments and make sure that the governments actually listen to what civil society organizations are asking and telling these governments. Just a quick recap from the poly-crisis or the multi-crisis that the world is living now and has been announced for a few years already by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and several government representatives talk quite a bit about this poly-crisis, which involves the climate emergency, involves the growth of inequality, involves the wars that have been starting and continuing in the world. There's about 30 wars in the world. We mostly hear about the most covered by the media, but there are several other wars that are going on or in preparation that we don't hear much about in the media. And also The crisis involve economic vulnerability, financial vulnerability caused by financial arrangements and what we call the international financial architecture. So those are the causes, or some of the causes, of the polycrisis, of the multi-crisis that the world lives at this moment. Not everywhere at the same time in the same way, but with a lot of influence back and forth, particularly from the developed countries towards the developing countries. And some of the components of this polycrisis have been dealt with and have been warned by civil society organizations for more than 20 years. The debt stress of about 80 countries, with a high sovereign debt situation. One of them is the Brazilian neighbor, Argentina, that continues to be in default, and owes more than $50 billion to the IMF. It's in extreme vulnerability, but at the same time, the markets are giving some slack to Argentina because they elected a president that is somewhat sympathetic to completely open doors economic theory, which is this kind of new libertarian way of the state not being responsible for governing, which is quite complicated, that actually the markets favor this kind of attitude in many ways. Thinking that kind of attitude is actually going to make the situation better because there'll be some money saved in very, priority areas such as public services, for instance, which is one of the responsibilities of government, to pay interest and to pay the service of the debt of the country that have been contracted by different politicians for different reasons and with not a lot of transparency, quite a bit of opacity on what the money was used for, because many times the money that is borrowed in a sovereign, highly indebted country is to pay new services of new debt. So those monies are actually not invested in the country to be able to get a return on the investment, and that return on the investment would be exactly the leverage that would comply with the payment of the service, because we have governance problems, we have corruption problems, and many times those resources that the countries save to pay the service debt, the debt was actually used not for investing, not for developing, not for infrastructure, but it stayed, as we say in Brazil, stayed along the way through the intermediary process. It kept on bleeding until it finally reaches the desired investment objective of the end. And that creates a debt cycle, an indebtedness cycle of the countries, and leave the countries in a very vulnerable situation because they retort to austerity policies, cutting public services, cutting basic infrastructure investment, such as social security, such as labor laws, so they can flexibilize and punish more the population. That's how civil society sees. But the point is, civil society has been advising and recommending governments on proper policy development for more than 20 years in the space of the G20 and the space of the G7. International financial architecture reform, including transparency and accountability reforms for the major international financial institutions such as the World Bank, such as the IMF, such as the multilateral development banks, that would include the Asian Bank, for instance, the North American Development Bank, the European Development Bank, and many other development banks that exist in the world, that the model of development was had been imposed upon the country for the past 30 years was just increasing inequality, was increasing the environmental crisis, because nothing had really changed in the model of development, in those investments made by large corporations, made by large projects, large national and international projects, such as construction of major dams to solve electricity problems, in a moment where for 30 years already we know that there are problems and spillover effects of mega projects, both social issues come out with mega projects, such as environmental issues come out with mega projects, even if it's a dam, that's, it's a clean, renewable, clean between quotes, renewable energy generation process, also has spillover effects, has land grabbing, has people need to move from their original land, most of the time indigenous population or Afro-descendant original populations in the case of Latin America and North America as well. And then in other places like in India, where there was this fever of dam construction for the longest time, there was a lot of land grabbing, a lot of displacement, a lot of migration caused by that. So in a sense, what we need to do, in a sense, is, and also government, is to heed the call from civil society organizations that are on the ground and that really witness the struggle of the peoples, and pay attention to what the civil society organizations are demanding when they decide to block a certain mega project, or when they decide to protest against the installation of a new car manufacturing plant that is being subsidized by public resources, or when the civil society organizations complain about the use of public resources to de-risk the investment of private capital to try to change the paradigm of economic development in the nations. We have, at this moment, an inevitable and uncorrectable path towards environmental destruction and crisis in a large scale. The planet is warming up. Last year, we already passed the threshold of 1.5 degrees since the pre-industrial era. And even though we'll have to maintain for about 20 years in that passing that threshold, which is possibly and probably the case, that's going to happen now in 2024 and then later in 2025. And the fact that for the past 20 years, we're supposed to cut our emissions by 45%. So the countries have committed to actually cut their emissions by 45% until 2030. For instance, in the case of a country like Brazil and all the other 9 countries that have the Amazon forest in its territory, it would be to stop deforestation. It would not be a question of reducing deforestation, because that's what's happening in Brazil during this government right now, which is very positive compared to the extremely negative case of the past government that was stimulating deforestation. Now we have a government that actually is trying to stop deforestation, but in a very slow rate, because deforestation is still going on, not only in Brazil, but also in Bolivia, also in Colombia, also in Venezuela. So most of the countries that actually the Amazon borders still have deforestation going on. And we definitely need a full stop. Like, there's no more time to waste, because the influence in the weather has been huge, and it's causing a lot of disruption. Droughts in some places, floods in some other places, lack of water for instance, for countries that depend on water for energy generation, that's quite complicated. Even though it's renewable, but if you don't have water for the rivers, then your dams and your power generation factories is not going to work. Something else as well, the droughts in Central America. Nobody was expecting that a prolonged drought in Central America would completely jeopardize the transportation through the Panama Canal that has been reduced by 1/3 for the past 6 months because of drought. So we have logistical problems, we have commerce problems that's being created by this whole global, climate emergency that is unfolding in front of our eyes. And not only that, not only did we did not reduce the amount of emissions by 45% until 2030, but in the past 12 years, actually, we increased the amount of emissions by 35%, because we have more cars on the road, we have more, stations burning coal for electricity when the water is not enough to power the plants, the hydroelectric plants. So that creates an effect of what we call a feedback loop. And that feedback loop, both environmentally and socially and economically, because we talked about debt, we talked about austerity policies that are reducing public services for the people that need, because they are in dire situation, because created not only by the weather, but also created by the concentration of wealth in the countries. So we have this feedback loop of crisis that is about to explode, in a sense, coming very close to the end of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So I don't know how much time I have. You can flag me on that, so when I need to conclude. But the 2030 Agenda, as well as the Paris Accord for climate change, as well as the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for financing for development, financing for sustainable development, needs a big shakeup. And the G20 and the G7 are a group of countries that, as Patricia talked about in the beginning, many civil society organizations and many people, and even some companies as well, do not consider those groups as legitimate groups because they do not involve all countries of the world. So the G20 now involves the 20 richest economies in the world, plus the African Union, which is joined for the first time this year during the Brazilian presidency. And that increases the amount of representation within the G20. But the G20, as well as the G7, they do not have official binding power. Their decisions, it's not officially binding in the sense that all the countries are going to adopt those decisions. It's more of kind of a recommendation process that it would be good for the countries to adopt those recommendations to increase the betterment of government in those countries. But there's something quite interesting compared the G20 and decisions made at the UN, at the United Nations level. The United Nations level also is non-binding. So the countries are not forced to adopt the United Nations resolutions, except for the Security Council that has the veto power and other things. All the other resolutions are non-binding. So it's also very voluntary that the countries need to adopt, going through Parliament, Congress, executive power and things. But at least at the UN, you have the full representation of the world. And in the G20 and the G7, you have a limited representation of the world. That's the criticism that many civil society organizations have. But to that, I also have to say the train has already left the station. The G20, even though it's not officially binding, in many ways, it carries a lot more weight on certain decisions, particularly financial and economic decisions, than the UN itself. Many times a resolution from the G20 spills over onto the UN, and the UN ends up adopting and said, yeah, we note that decision by the G20, like the DSSI, which was the relief of debt during the pandemic for the poorest countries of the world. That was very much a G20 decision, and it was executed very swiftly. Not that it helped or worked as it was thought out, because there was a lot of caveats in economic and financial decisions, particularly the fact that the analysis of a country is made by a handful of credit rating agencies, all private, that constitute some an oligopoly of credit rating agencies. And for the country to access the monies from the DSSI, which was the reduction of the service of the sovereign debts, like a freeze of the service of the sovereign debts of these countries during the pandemic. But the credit agencies did not like that. And if the country applied for DSSI, then the credit agency would reduce the credit rating for the country. And that would complicate the country because then it would not be able to access other capital markets to fulfill its obligations. So it creates this very strange conundrum in the economic financial infrastructure of the world, what we call the international financial architecture. And both the G7 and the G20 and the UN, particularly the Financing for Development Forum, have recognized now for more than 5 years that there is a pressing need to reform the international financial architecture. That countries cannot be so dependent and cannot be so vulnerable to decisions made by governments, past governments, that actually jeopardize the present and the future of their populations in their territories. That needs to be addressed, because for the past 30 years, what we have seen is more concentration of wealth in the richest countries, increase of inequality and poverty in the poorest countries. Even ODA, which is the official development assistance, have reduced by a lot since 2015, when these agreements were signed by all the countries, particularly the official development assistance to the least developed countries, because a lot of the developed countries started using some of those resources to take care of some in-border issues like the explosion of migration, military assistance, without realizing and without thinking. Of course, they do realize as
Claudio,
intellectuals.
¿podemos ir concluyendo?
Excellent, thank you very much. Which is the fact that this is a consequence of an accumulation of many bad decisions that were made in the past 30 years. Government decisions, state decisions, and indebtedness, increasing indebtedness creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates more inequality. And that goes, it's a feedback loop of things. And what we have to say is that from the civil society point of view, we have plenty of very sincere, in good faith recommendations on how to fix those processes. And both the G7 and the G20 needs to really have the courage to face the need for reforming the international financial architecture, international financial institutions, including the multilateral development banks, include the reallocation of the special drawing rights of the IMF, and to be able to free fiscal space for the countries to invest in their development. And as a final note, I would like to remind everyone that development in history, we can follow that in history, development is something that has been achieved with public resources. The private capital comes when the infrastructure is already installed, when the public resources have already invested in the basis of the country. And then private capital actually comes in when it finds its environment, and then it can keep on progressing in that development process. But development is strictly something that has been achieved throughout history with the use and the positive and proper use of public resources. And that needs to be taken into consideration instead of trying to get some of those public resources to de-risk or to invite private capital in a situation where private capital would be defying its own nature, which is to take risks. And I hope it was clear enough in all these feedback processes. And thank you very much, Patricia.
Thanks, Claudia, very much. You have set on the table a number of issues and the challenges for G20 and G7, and also inviting civil society organizations to be better informed about the impacts, also the importance that they should focus on people and the relationship with other organizations like the United Nations. Thanks very much for attending this webinar.
And now I would like to give the floor to Monica Di Sisto. Monica, Italy is currently the host of the G7, but has been also the host of the G20 in the past. You have been following both and their policies for a while. What is, in your view, the evolution and the current role of these groups? Monica, please.
Thank you so much. Patricia, thank you so much for the work we are doing together and for this occasion to debate. And G7 will mark its 50th anniversary this year when Italy hosted the summit in Apulia in June. And this informal group has been created as a platform for economic and financial cooperation in the first 70s in response to energy crisis. But the initial composition of the group clearly represented the dominant economic powers of the day, and they shared the additional characteristic to be largely Atlantic-oriented and militarily allied to the US. And since the 70s, representative of the European Economic Community and now the European Union participated in the group, stressing the importance of being united by common values and principles, freedom, democracy, human rights. And this is something that we take care of in our daily lives as civil society, and to promote them in the international area. But this role has been played from the beginning in a non-transparent way and with many difficulties for civil society to participate and to make itself heard, in addition to the fact that we represent the point of view of a small minority of countries in the work since the beginning. And from an ad hoc gathering to discuss very practical financial challenges, it has become a more formal, prominent venue through the years to address major global issues. And the addition of Russia in 1997 was made as an effort to encourage Russia to become a free market and a liberal democracy with a commitment to the international processes and that the G7 considered acceptable at that time. And in 1995, the WTO was born. And we did the attempt to extend this Atlantic neoliberal development model beyond the Iron Curtains. And this model is a big part of the actual problems we are facing in this multi-crisis we are trying to address. And over the years, while the G7 agendas remain focused on economic and financial issues, increasingly the leaders have taken on a broader range of topics. And this is the reason why ministerial meetings has been created. And in the ministerial meetings of the financial ministers, slowly several ministers of several countries and partner countries has been associated and has been, I'm being very, very quick, sorry to the interpreters, and has been associated and invited in order to discuss the emerging, the problems of the emerging economies and the fact that they were insufficiently included in this global economic management shaping efforts. And then we faced the crisis in 2008, the big financial crisis, and the US economy was in free fall. It became increasingly clear that the organization that had driven liberalization to that point of ungovernability, World Bank, the IMF, as well as G8, were incapable of managing alone such a terrible crisis. And I remember, and this was very impressed in my mind when President George W. Bush called together the leaders of the G20 countries to review the progress being made to address the financial crisis, advance a common understanding of its causes, in order to avoid a repetition and agree on a common set of principles for reform the regulatory system of the finance and of the economic system at that time. But maybe this is the first time when we saw that there was no political will to bring the government of the process of a more democratic and social-oriented exit from the financial crisis back to the United Nations, back to the multilateral process. And yes, I agree with Claudio that G7, G20, every place is good, you know, in order to for us, civil society, to be populated, in order to have answer to our questions and to our needs of an increase in protection of human rights and environmental rights. But the rules are different. And $1, one vote is an important question that is still on the table. And the fact that G20 started to coordinate the economic stimulus packages, but also stepped to extricate themselves from them when the debt, they cause a new debt increasing, avoiding protectionism, but also had no possibility to protect their infant industries from the global, the rise in global competition and address the global imbalances, and also tripling the financial resources of the IMF, reinvigorating our moribund institution. We need to ask to ourselves if it was the best choice to do in that moment. But in any case, of course, as Claudio recalled, we know the agendas. We evaluated the agendas since then, the G20 and G7 agenda, now 7. But 20 is better than 8 or 7, of course. But the results of choices made and not made are before our eyes. So we need to stress that the transformation is strongly needed, and is needed now before the war economy becomes the only relaunch factor that the leading economies look to restart a global market paralyzed by an economy that devastated the planet and the beings who inhabit it by practicing social and climatic injustice. And let's go to, I'm very happy to invite you to my country for the last part of this introduction, because in January 1st, 2024, Italy assumed the presidency for the 7th time of the G7, succeeding Japan, and we will hand it over to Canada at the end of the year. But let's give a quick look to the Italian agenda. The effect of COVID-19 pandemic and the growing climate crisis, together as well with the ongoing war in Ukraine, has diverted attention away from broader development objectives. G7 attention is now focused on the need for diversification in global supply chain, diversifying and de-risking au pair partnership. For instance, Italy invited Ukraine, South Korea, and Emirates to the first ministerial, despite all the human rights concern we have facing Emirates and South Korea way to deal with development, for instance. Let's call things by the name which we studied them at the university. Tide aid is back. And now it's called the G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, Piano Mattei in Africa, as the Italian government call his new proposal, driven by Italians' domestic concerns, particularly migration and energy. There's no new commitment in sight, in-depth restructuring or alleviation, just a reiteration of all commitments and a reiteration of the need to reform the international financial architecture and MDBs, the multilateral development banks. But how? And we have answers to offer, and we had through the years proposals not to arrive at this point of despair. But unfortunately, we are in this situation now. And in this context, I believe the celebration of the G20 in Brazil represent for all of us a great hope and a great challenge to correct this direction, which does not convince us and does not align with our values of democracy and the future. And the choice made by C7, the Civil 7, our coordination, and C20 to go together in this challenge is politically very significant, in my opinion. But for us, even more significant is the choice we have made to potentially open up this advocacy work to associations from all over the world, and an opening that is permanent in our process. We must look with hope at this exercise of effective democracies and challenging all our governments to be worthy of it in all the places we manage to inhabit, from palaces to squares. And let's discuss further the proposals we can bring together along in these two important events in Italy and then in Brazil. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Monica, for this review of how these groups were created, where who had their essence the issue of the financial economic crisis and for discussing the G7 priorities and what are the concerns and proposals from civil society. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias. Now I would like to give the floor to our colleague May Bonaventura. May, the G20 has been hosted in Asia for the last 2 years. APMDD has been following G20 policies and priorities for a long time. You release declarations and you have your own analysis. What are the economic and geopolitical implications of these groups' decisions?
Yeah, thank you, Patricia, and I hope you can hear me well.
We do.
So, good evening from Manila, and I'm going to speak in English, but I'm going to turn off my video after I introduce myself because the signal is not too strong. So, hi. So, diving right into the topic, thank you to the previous speakers who explained a lot about the G7 and G20. So indeed, no, for the longest time that they've been around, we've been feeling a lot of impacts of their decisions that have resulted in even more hardships for people of the South. So one of the often diving into the G20, for example, one of the often cited positive qualities is their alleged effectiveness way back in dealing with the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis. So they advocated increasing IMF resources, regulatory reforms, fiscal expansion to boost growth. They also claimed to be helping developing countries by to help them gain access to finance, including liquidity facilities and program support. They really partner closely with the International Monetary Fund and also committed to ensuring that the IFIs, the international financial institutions, including the World Bank also and other multilateral development banks, have the resources they need, which of course means more lending being pushed. And that's what happened actually after some time. That was the outcome of their supposedly good management of the financial crisis then, which was the accumulation of debt. So more recently, Claudia also mentioned the debt service suspension initiative, which the G20 and the Paris Club created during the peak, the height of the COVID-19. And as the name suggests, it was merely suspending the payment. So until 2024 this year, countries that applied for it are paying for the loans that were the debt service that was postponed in addition to the sum that was owed at the time. So not surprisingly, only 73 countries or just over half of the developing countries were eligible, and it left out countries that were also defaulting, such as Sudan, Argentina, and Venezuela, including countries in my region classified as middle income, but with situations of deep inequality and poverty similar to many of the low-income countries. And of course, there's always this stipulation that you have to be under an IMF lending program, which, as we know, carries with it a lot of belt tightening or austerity measures that really unfairly impact the poor and low income. So of the debt that's actually suspended, that only amounted to 5 billion or less than 0.2% of the total amount of the public external debt of the countries to the South at the time. And so with all these criticisms of the DSSI, they also admitted to its shortcomings, but the need to overhaul it did not happen, of course. And there were only limited measures being introduced, such as the extension, not really substantive changes, but extending the repayment period. And another one is the adoption of the so-called common framework for debt treatments beyond the DSSI, which also involves non-Paris Club bilateral creditors. And of course, again, the requirement to be part of lending program of the IMF. So we know now what is happening to the debt, and it's at a level, the problem is at a level that's worse than before, which is also a very clear indication that these measures have not worked. And if we look back at the previous measures of the G7 and the G20, like the highly indebted poor countries initiative, this was more or less more of the same, tweaking here and there, but really not really changing the measure substantively. And so the so-called debt relief, there's no relief at all. No? And let's not forget that painful time during COVID when vaccines were so scarce, and G7 countries or G20 countries also actually claimed to lead global coordinated action, but this never happened. And in fact, it all boiled down or was reduced to vaccine hoarding and nationalism. And we remember the really intransigence of Germany and Britain, while the rest, the large, millions of people were suffering, uncertain about their lives and their future under COVID, and that they did not budge on their pledges to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Also on the climate, we know that the G20 represents 80% of emissions. So it's only fair, according to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, that they must shoulder the large part of responsibility for keeping the 1.5-degree goal alive. But we continue to campaign for, that's why we continue to campaign, seeking responsibility for the rich countries to deliver climate finance in the form of grants as a matter of justice, as a matter of historical responsibility. And today, not one of the G20 member countries are on target to meet their emissions reductions or climate finance pledges, which they often talk about as important to them, and all that recognition of how overarching the climate crisis is and so on, but not one of them is meeting the challenge for delivering climate finance. And in fact, they're pushing again for more loans on the global south to incur and to fund the transition. So it's pretty much similar to the G7, which is a more the smaller group of countries of really advanced economies. So it's older than the G20, and obviously united politically and ideologically, and it talks more on geopolitical and security issues, no, than the G20. And also they individually, we should look at the G7 as G7, but also we should look at them individually as countries. And they were also slow to provide vaccines to poor countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. On climate pledges, also the same as the G7 countries are also in the G20. And on debt, there's been several decisions on debt. And that was also the time at the height of the Jubilee South of the debt justice campaigning in the 90s. And some of those milestones where we saw, for example, the support of G7 for the World Bank's HIPIC, or the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. And it was, of course, widely criticized by civil society for being limited in scope, just as the current so-called debt relief measures are. Very strict eligibility criteria. It imposed conditionalities that actually resulted in more harm than good. It prioritized debt servicing over social services. And we also see at this time the wave of privatization of essential services, that they were pushing governments to surrender to private providers in order to, as their way of saying, that's how you save on your revenue so that you can pay your debt. So that remained a priority. So as we had feared, as we had warned in civil society, there was again the reaccumulation of debt and the failure to address systemic and structural issues. Then again, there was HIPIC 2. And if we remember, maybe some of us were not born yet during that time. That was in 1999 when the G7 leaders gathered in Cologne in Germany, and they agreed on a debt relief initiative that was an enhancement of HIPIC 1. But this really was almost an insult, no, to what civil society had been demanding, because it's simply, tweaking here and there, increasing number of eligibility, extending the periods, and so on. But it didn't do anything that's substantive. So at the time, we were still called Jubilee South Asia Pacific, and we criticized it, of course, as refusing to acknowledge the moral dimensions of the debt crisis and the historical responsibility of rich countries for the dire state of affairs. And then also several other decisions from 2005 during the Glen Eagle Summit that it actually resulted in debt cancellation for several low-income countries, and followed also by the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative building on HIPIC 1 and 2. But again, as we know now, this has not, sorry for that, for the fast way I'm speaking. As we know now, these have all failed, these measures. And so it's really tragic that the current debt relief measures are simply rehashed from these previous so-called debt relief mechanisms. So again, in climate, it's also very dismal. The G7 pledged to wipe out their contribution to the climate emergency in 2021. But what's their solution being pushed? It's what they call net zero, no? Not absolute zero. It's net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which we think is really, a huge deception, because it's still, a permission to pollute. So in more recent years, we have a common framework, which also we continue to critique for being ineffective, flawed, and futile. It still excludes middle-income countries. It's only limited to bilateral loans. And really, the hypocrisy of the IMF and the World Bank, they push for debt relief, but exempt themselves. So these are all supported by both the G7 and the G20, these IFIs. And maybe just to conclude, just to remind us all that, as I said earlier, even as we look at the G7 and G20 as platforms, as forums, we also need to look at them individually as countries. And I'm referring to the illegitimate debts that the G7 countries have incurred. And you can cite any country there in the G7 for all these illegitimate debts, like, for example, even the time of Suharto in Indonesia and Germany exporting warships despite knowing about the political repression in the country. Also in my own country, funding by the US for a flawed nuclear project. Also in Canada, supporting the construction of big dams in Argentina and Paraguay. So all these, we must revive the narrative of illegitimate debt, because there's a lot to claim. There's a lot for the G7 and G20 countries to account for. So maybe to close, I was struck by by Claudio that has it been more than 20 years? So I know I feel very old. So it's been more than 2-3 decades that we've been advising, sending proposals to the of course, we know that we've been more often than not, we are ignored. So to me, this is not depressing. It's in fact a huge challenge that there's the urgency for us to do more, to educate and organize and mobilize bigger actions, because so much is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very
Muchas
much,
gracias,
May,
May,
for the
por además
strengths
poner
of what
con
you said
esta
about
pinza el tema
the
de la
debt
deuda
issue in
de tantos años y
various
distintas
crises that
crisis
the
que
G20
no han
and
podido
G7
responder de
have
forma
not been able to
efectiva para
address.
una resolución
The
de la deuda,
resolution of
que
the debt
además
crisis
pueda tener un impacto
could
en el
have
mediano y largo
an
plazo,
impact on the
así
medium and
como
long
el
term,
tema de
and
la deuda
also, of course,
ilegítima
the
y el impacto en los
issue of
países en
illegitimate
subdesarrollo,
debt
que
of
han
the
ido quedando
least
fuera
developed
de las
countries that have
políticas
been
económicas en los últimos años.
left out
Y por esta
of
autorregulación para la
the
sociedad civil. Now I would like to
debate,
give the
international
floor
debate.
to Tatiana Beringer. Tatiana, thanks so much for joining us today. The world's eyes are on G20 Brazil this year. We have listened today that there are many challenges in terms of economic issues, inequalities, climate, health, prevention, middle and long-term policies. Brazil has the presidency of the G20 this year. 1 year can be too short to change the world, but can be also the right time to and long enough to start with key policies towards the main changes or towards starting the systemic changes that the world needs. Please tell us, what are the G20 finance track priorities? Thank you.
You, Patricia. Can you see me?
We can see you and hear you perfectly.
I really
Now
want
we
to
can hear you. Okay, now we do.
Now, yeah.
Now we can.
Okay, I want to congratulate the Latinidad, the C20, and also Jubilee, Monica, Sesto, everyone here. It's a very pleasure to hear for you, to know how the civil society is, is being engaged in this process to build a new financial architecture to address these challenges and how we can make progress on this agenda. As you know, the Brazilian presidency of G20 addressed 3 main priorities: the combat to hunger and poverty, the financing for sustainable development, and the reform of global governance. And in this sense, there are 2 task forces: the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, both Alliance, and the Task Force for Climate Change. And we also, these initiatives are trying to join the finance track with the Sherpas track. And we also have this initiative to enforce the social participation. That's the idea, is to join all these teams and also to strengthening the channels in the debate with the civil society. When I mean civil society, we are talking about the engagement groups that exist and to the framework of G20, but we also want to expand this social base, because we really believe that this can make progress on the new finance architecture. So we have I want to announce that we will have a space dedicated, a session dedicated to the deputies meeting in July, to the civil society presentation of the demands and inputs. It's really important that you can prepare yourself, besides the C20 and the T20 and so on, to be there, to have your documents and your priorities listen for the deputies, for the vice ministers, for finance and central banks. think it will be an important moment, and I'm very happy to talk to you about this. So how finance track is addressing the combat to inequality and the research for just transitions. I think that's the main priorities for the new finance architecture. That's what we can see this also, how the finance track working groups and priorities are putting the Brazilian presidents in March. So the first point is we agree, we believe, we share the idea that the world has been hit by multiple crises and inequalities within and between countries needs to be faced. So as well as international institutions governance. So in terms of inequalities, I think inequalities are in the forefront of the macroeconomic and distributive implications. So for that, it's important to create fiscal space to support a better public investment or private investment, and to have more research mobilizations to public policies. That's the first idea. So how we are talking to the Ministry of Finance and to the central banks that the inequalities must be in the center of the macroeconomic policies. And we need to make a new foreign macroeconomic policy that can have fiscal space and inequalities, combat to inequalities in the center of this. That's the first point. And for that, we really believe, I think that for international taxation is a priority. So as you know, the G20 and the OECD has put in March a debate about taxation during last years, but we want to have an agenda that go beyond and above BEPS, or the base erosion and profit shifting, and also can enforce the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. So we have put on the table a proposal of international cooperation process to tax super rich. And the idea is that this tax can contribute to reduce inequalities. The idea is what we're talking about super rich is the billionaires. So we can have these 3,000 billionaires in the world, asking them or tax them 2% of their fortune and address it to reduce inequalities or to combat inequalities and apply for just transitions. Or it doesn't matter how we use this research, but this can generate about $150 billion for development initiatives. That's the idea what we are addressing, and we really hope we can move forward with this. I think the other aspects when we are talking about international finance architecture is to making the multilateral development banks better, big, and more effective. And for that, we are talking about to build a roadmap that can enforce these resources and how different countries can address for these banks and make them more effective. Other aspects for the finance architecture is to making the global finance safe net more effective and representative. So for this, it's important to follow up on the progress of the implementation of the 16th round of IMF, and to make a discussion of the IMF Executive Board and World Bank. And it also is linked to address the sovereign debt issues. That the idea is that how can we talk about just transitions? How can we talk about sustainable development if we are facing this debt crisis? So we see that debt and development strategies are intrinsically connected. The idea is to put a real debate on debt and analysis the landscape and the vulnerabilities in low and income countries, and promoting a map and the reports that we can work to about alternatives on debt distress, specifically on African countries. So, and hence Brazil is trying to create any space. It will probably be in June for African-led debate on debt. The idea is to give voice for the debtors to present their alternatives, their point of view on that. We also are thinking about an update of the common framework and how evaluate these initiatives. I think it's also important when we're talking about just transitions. So if you have international taxation, and then if we have the it's in the center of macroeconomic policies, then we can move forward to think about infrastructure and finance climate change. How it can be generate a new perspectives for people's life. In these terms, I think the finance for climate resilient infrastructure is important, and it means that the infrastructure it needs to be looking for reduction of poverty, for the mitigating risks, impacts, and build cross-border infrastructure in a globalization world is important. We have real connection between countries and societies. For the last point, I think, is how to improve the climate fundings and the sustainable finances and optimizing operations. So for that, it's important to reinforce the fundings that exist, but advancing in more credible, robust, and just transition plans. We need to think about what are the plans, what needs to be in the center of these strategies to mitigate negative social and economic impacts and so on. And how to think about finance nature-based solutions, how to generate a new world that can be in the center of social and environmental aspects. So the idea that the finance track is putting on the table is that we have in Brazil now the ecological transformation plan, that it means to have a new kind of industrialization, thinking about de-specialization, facing the nearshoring, reshoring, but giving to the South, giving to other regions, increase in technology, but that this needs to be based on the combat of inequalities and on sustainable projects. So that's the idea. That's what we're trying as G20 presidents, as Patricia mentioned, to strengthening the civil society engagement, to give this as a deliverable for the G20 experience, and also address inequalities in the center of macroeconomic policies and international taxation as a way to have more resources and to have more inequalities among and between nations. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana, for those
gracias,
insights,
Tatiana,
and
por ese
surely
detalle.
it is
Una
important
responsabilidad para
to
muchos,
have
muy
more
interesante conocer
specific
con mayor
issues con respect
especificidad
with
algunos
international
temas,
taxation and
Eurotax,
indebtedness, and
estos
all the
planes,
meetings
cuanto a
that'll be held with the
reuniones
civil society organizations
con
about debt issues, or
sociedad
the
civil sobre temas de
specific
vivienda o
meeting
específicas
on
sobre
debt led by the
deuda,
African nations. And I would
es
like
muy
now to
interesante.
open
Quiero
a
abrir
short Q&A session.
un pequeño
If you
espacio
have
de
any,
preguntas y
I'm
respuestas.
going to
Si
take
tuvieran, voy a
some
tomar algunas
3 of
dudas,
your
tres
questions,
probablemente.
and I'm going to
Entonces,
mention one with them for
voy mencionando
Tatiana.
algunas de
Tatiana,
ellas. Una de ellas es para Tatiana. Tatiana, what is the G20's position about special drawing rights? And this could be another issuance, but also the rechanneling to that the G20 has a specific view about this. Another question is if you would be able to elaborate on finance-based nature solutions. So we have so far these two questions for Tatiana. Tatiana, please go ahead.
Okay. About SDR, we think we're making an analysis of it. Oh, sorry, I lose my. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
I
can.
just lose my battery of my phones. We are trying to make an analysis about SDR, so putting on the table the bits on that. And second question was about?
The second question was about to have a solution based on a finance-based nature solution.
Okay. The finance, yeah, that's a good point. When we are talking about nature-based solution, we are trying to adapting existing financial solutions as blended finance instruments, how they can be looking for development countries to contribute to climate resilience, biodiversity conservation, and local community development. So we also have this in this task force about climate change. We have the initiative of bioeconomy in G20. So I think that's the idea, is to think more and to share experience about bioeconomy, of circular economy, and how they can make progress in this just transition.
Thank you, Tatiana. And as you can see, there are other questions also for you. The next one is from Barry. He says, how does Brazil envisage the alliance against hunger and poverty working? And if other G20 countries have expressed interest about this?
Now I could see the questions. So the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty in a very good reception between state members and also with IOs. It's really impressive. We had, I think, 15 days ago or 20 days ago, the first session of in-person meeting. And the idea of this global alliance is to work with 3 pillars: the national experience that can be shared and put on a basket, that the countries can access this. So it's the idea of sharing know-how and experience. The second pillar is the knowledge, the multilateral knowledge on that. So how we can think about create this basket that the different countries can access this, and the third one is how to think about the financialization of this process. It's not to build a new port or a new funding, but how we can join this funding is how we can multilaterally enforce these initiatives. So I think as the moment the world is suffering a lot after COVID-19 and after many crises, now we really have a space to put hunger and poverty in the priority of multilateral initiatives. And so we are really hopefully that these initiatives can be a big deliverable for a G20 presidency.
Thank you, Tatiana. And I will take this last question that is also addressed to you: how collective business, such as cooperatives, can be placed in the scheme of things of the G7. And taking advantage of my role of moderator, I would like also to ask you about your views about debt swaps, the debt swaps 2.0, we can call them, the ones that are now being implemented. They are not a silver bullet. They won't solve the debt crisis nor the climate crisis. But if they are implemented without the current controversies, they can have a contribution in both crises. So what is the G20's views about this? Thank you.
Okay. So I think about cooperatives, we can talk in how it is managed to by economy strategies, but also how to have more initiatives on the combat of inequality. So we can how we can have big companies and how we can have support for small and mid companies and so on. That can be a good idea. Debt swaps. Well, so we have debt swaps proposals on the health and finance joint task force. That's one idea. We just addressed the idea of debt swaps for hunger or fight climate, but I think it's really something that it's not easy to manage, and it's important to think, especially when you're talking about debtors' view, how they want to negotiate this and how it can be or not be a specific an alternative. The idea is that we really are looking how to create more, to generate more resources for finance the just transition and not just focus on debt swaps. I think it can be a way, but it's under the notes. We have planned it, and I think it's now being discussed.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. And I would like to invite Monica and May So to ask you if you have any brief reactions and also final remarks.
By my side, I'm really happy to hear the position of the Brazilian government, and I have high hopes that everything will be unfinished by our side, can be addressed in that framework, and we are really happy to look forward and to help from outside the push to the approval of this important program. And I think that it's an engagement that does G7, C7, C20 is already on the table, and it will be stronger than before, I think.
Thanks very much, Monica.
Muchas gracias,
Yes.
Mónica. May?
Thank you very much. So I echo also the sentiment that we're very excited, and we really look forward to the conference in Brazil, in engaging civil society, especially coming from what we think was disastrous under the presidency of Modi. So now we see really a great opportunity to raise our issues and to have the kind of openness that enables fruitful dialogue with with a multilateral platform. So I hope there's hope there that things can move forward in this year, because the crisis, really, both debt and climate, they're getting really worse, and the situation, especially of the poor and impoverished, is really becoming more untenable, and that, of course, also increases the tensions geopolitically. So yeah, see you in Brazil.
Thank
Thank
you, May.
you.
Tatiana, do you have any final message?
Oh, I just want to reinforce the invitation for this People Summit is here in Brazil, just a few days before the Leader Summit is in November, and we force the idea that it's to be a process. So you need to prepare yourselves, not to be engaged in these debates. It's really important to have initiatives like that today, and also prepare and give your demands through the C20 or T20, Labor 20, as we were engaged on, to July meeting. And thank you so much. It was a really good pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Tatiana. Monica, May. Claudia had to leave us earlier, but he is very much committed to all these processes. Thanks to the members of the panel for engaging in this dialogue and for the opportunity of learning how these processes are moving forward from various standpoints. There is Tatiana's invitation to meet in Brazil, and I want to underscore the importance that G20 Brazil has created this space that's the finance track, which is not a space where civil society can discuss these issues that are at the core, that are the economic issues in the multi-crisis scenario. Thanks very much to the participants for their interest, and to the translators as well. Until the next time.
Thank
you.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for the
Bye.
presentation, the invitation.
Bye.
See you in Brazil.